Now, moving on into contemporary art, our next speaker is the recently appointed Artistic Director of the National Museum of Contemporary Art here in Athens, Katerina Gregos, an international curator, lecturer, and writer who for many years has consistently explored the relationship between art, society, and politics. The title of her talk is The Role of the Contemporary Art Museum in a Rapidly Changing World, How to Remain Relevant. Katerina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia. And of course, thank you to the Benaki Museum for inviting me. I'd like to start my talk by saying that museums have never had to face more challenges than today, especially those that are publicly funded. They're called upon to address a plethora of issues from equity, diversity, and decolonization to democratization and sustainability, while at the same time having to deal with the increasingly asphyxiating demands made by politicians and funders who view museums as quantifiable entities, seeing only numbers, either in terms of visitors or income, and being mostly unaware of the burdens and complex tasks museums face today. Paradoxically, museums are also asked to perform ever more tasks at a time when public funding is diminishing. At the same time, their social role is being highlighted more than ever before, rendering them vulnerable. The proliferation and success of private museums with their generous endowments, resources, and budgets are coming to be seen as models to be emulated by public institutions without any comprehension that the two are very, very different beasts with different responsibilities and mandates and outlooks for the future. Public museums, which I must say I'm a fervent advocate for, apart from being custodians of culture for future generations, are now expected to act as entertainment and community centers, zones of inclusion, producers of discursive content, public programming events, purveyors of education and mediation, procurers of tourism, and even as activist organizations. All of this while having to deal with issues of sustainability and climate change, and indeed addressing the needs of many different audiences. Indeed, I would say that it often seems as if museums are expected to cure all the ills of society without being in the position to do so, and putting aside the fact that this is actually not the mission of museums. May we please have a change in the slide, as I cannot see my screen for the moment. So let us dwell for a moment on the new draft definition proposed by ICOM, in 2019, which was postponed following much debate at ICOM's Extraordinary General Assembly later that year. And I quote, "Museums are democratizing inclusive and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures. Acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Museums are not for profit. They are participatory and transparent and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understanding of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being." That is quite a handful, I must say. You can also see the old definition from 2007, and you can actually juxtapose the two. Now, this new draft definition has been very hotly debated. Despite the noble intentions, what strikes me as being rather awkward is the rather bold last claim about, I quote again, "human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being." The phrase, I have to say, sounds as it's been taken from a United Nations press release. No doubt these are goals all societies should strive for through democratic politics and civic institutions. But articulating such a rather extravagant mission for the finite scope any museum has shows the extent to which museums have been forced to stretch their mandates in order to prove their value and legitimize their purpose. Recent discussions focus very much on the social responsibility and the ethical parameters of museums, no doubt important issues, but very often the essence gets left behind. And that essence is the content, be it the visual culture or art, that which the museum is there to collect, to safeguard, present, promote, mediate, and of course, make accessible in the first place. It's interesting to remark, by the way, that the words art, artifacts, objects, archives, documents, and culture are nowhere to be found in this draft definition. I believe in the revision of this definition, the word art has crept back in. Today, equity and diversity have become predominant issues in the development of museum discourse, and I'm sure that there are no museum directors out there who are not concerned with expanding and diversifying their audiences. At the same time, while it is true that most museums need to deal with questions of inequality at a structural level, the question that looms large, the elephant in the room that is can and indeed should museums do all of the things mentioned a little earlier on? Are they equipped to do the job? Do they have the necessary tools and adequate human and material resources? And the unspoken truth is that most museums, especially the smaller ones, cannot face up to all these challenges, though they seem to be locked in a constant, unsustainable struggle to tick all the right boxes. So, what can museums do to stay relevant and not bite off more than they can chew? First, they need to be honest and acknowledge the things they cannot do. Second, they have to focus in terms of content and outreach. Third, rather than trying to act as political or activist organizations, they should focus on their core mission, producing creative, critical, and intellectual and cultural content of meaning and relevance for society and their immediate communities, and selecting the social causes for which they want to fight. Fourth, they should resist incessant growth. And I'll come back to some of these points a little bit later. Apart from all the social and political considerations I've just mentioned, another major threat we face, and actually one we haven't given much thought to, is related to the nature and the culture of images today. Since the advent of the internet, our visual culture has dramatically changed. As it changed with the invention of photography, only now, perhaps even more drastically. Image making is no longer the privilege of artists, museums, and old media like cinema and television. Anyone can become an author, and everyone is becoming an author. Technology has exploded the possibilities of image making, and these images are not only multiplying at dizzying speed, they're also merging with other creative practices, creating beguiling interdisciplinary forms. Creative forms of image production are no longer exclusively in the hands of those educated in fine or graphic arts, advertising or lens-based strategies. Image production has been democratized to a degree that otherwise would have been unimaginable. Simply pondering on the kind of images that are being produced, for example, in video games or animation, and the mind boggles. And all of these images are being produced at dizzying speed and in massive numbers, and are accessible to millions and consumed voraciously in different media. I'm hearing the echoing of my voice. I hope the technicians can fix that. Where does that leave museums? Can you hear me, Sophia?
Yes, I can hear you. You're fine now.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I somehow thought I got lost. Where does that leave museums, former custodians of the canon of high culture and guardians of the highest forms of image making? What we've gained is the democratization of image production, But what we've lost is a clear idea of the value of all these images. It's almost as if visual culture has drowned in its own content and lost its meaning as a consequence of its tumescent expansion. The museum generally performed the function of image validation, but today this role is being contested and challenged. I will speak only for museums of contemporary art, of course. In order for the Museum of Contemporary Art to stay relevant, it must not lose sight of the fact that the culture of image making, its meanings and related issues of representation, and the contribution of museums in the education of how to read into and behind images at a time of the hyper explosion of image culture should be one of the priorities that museums have. So, the task of a contemporary museum should be to reinstate the value of the image and, of course, its meaning. And this is why I believe that exhibitions remain so important. Museums also need to remain places where one sees and experiences the kind of images that are not to be found elsewhere, images that are not interchangeable. I speak of creative images that resonate, that make us think, that linger in the mind, expand our understandings of the world, broaden our horizons, teach us things we don't know, raise awareness about the things that matter, address prejudices and biases, inspire us, stays with us, and frees our imagination. The kind of images that result from what we know as artistic practice. In order for museums of contemporary art to stay relevant, they must produce meaningful visual content that allows for reflection and the deceleration of viewing habits, and content that allows people to pause from the hyper-acceleration of contemporary life and the assault from the influx of images. To me, the museum is primarily a site of education, a place for the presentation, reflection, and debate of critical societal issues, a place where one can be inspired and which can fire the imagination, a place which can provide missing perspectives, understandings, and which highlight histories and stories that are lacking in mainstream education and culture. In short, it's a place where discourse and knowledge are produced in ways unlike those of other institutions, but it's also a place of meaningful enjoyment, risk, and play. Now, no matter how many social activities, events, and public programs one organizes, we must not forget that artistic content is what primarily brings people to the Contemporary Art Museum. And this content must be relevant to the geolocality of each museum, as well as the times we live in. It cannot reflect the tastes of the 1%, it cannot be geared to capturing international tourists alone, and it cannot be the same as what you see everywhere else. Museums need to first reflect on the spaces, social, political, cultural, and historical circumstances of the cities, countries, and regions in which they are situated, without falling into the trap of blockbusters, populism, and facile programming. In my opinion, the times of the globalized franchise or mirror mega museum built by the star architect to acquire cultural capital and attract tourists, things, of course, which are grounded in an unsustainable growth model, are over, or at least so it seems in this time of climate crisis and the global pandemic. Museums need to focus on their core constituents, their immediate surrounds, and then slowly grow outwards, building bridges to other worlds. Where museums in emerging regions once imitated institutional models emanating in Western capitals such as London, Berlin, Paris, and New York, they should now look to alternative models that are once authentic, less tied to convention, and more tied to local or regional histories and narratives that are more relevant to their constituents. It's time to abandon the one-size-fits-all globalized Western museum model and its franchises, and look into how museums can evolve into locally, culturally rooted versions without lapsing into isolationism or ethnocentricity. Museums, especially those not situated in the global metropolises, need to develop their own stories and narratives, pick their own battles, and choose their own values to defend. And if I'm to be a little critical, contemporary art museums of late have fallen into a trap of propagating a kind of consensus culture, And that's actually one of the last things they should be doing. A large majority of programming and discourse in Western contemporary art museums seems to revolve largely around identity politics. Now, no doubt this is a hugely important issue that needs constant advocacy, especially as regards minority rights. But the prevalence of identity politics in museum discourse nowadays means that many other equally important issues may be in danger of being marginalized. If we stick to one narrative alone, we risk becoming irrelevant to a large community of people who have other interests. If we focus only on the politics of grievances of identity, we might win the battle, but we will lose the war. The causes of identity politics are entirely justified, but in the wider perspective of things, the trouble is that it is inevitably too anthropocentric. As a time when the human needs to become decentered in order to make room for the non-human and all other forms of life and nature on this planet on which we are all dependent. With the climate crisis looming large and disappearing ecosystems, I'm sure you understand what I mean here. So, museum programming needs to diversify together with staff and audiences. Diversity and inclusion should, of course, be important goals of all museums. But it should also be reminded that a museum has to make choices in order to stay recognizable and relevant. Inclusion cannot mean that there are no criteria, and diversity cannot mean that all boxes have to be ticked. Museums have the important task to draw the line somewhere and to argue about what is relevant and important and what not. Now, as I draw to the end of my talk, speaking from the perspective of a museum in Southeastern Europe, particularly the National Museum of Contemporary Art, EMST, as it's known here in Athens, we are in a geopolitically and historically complex and volatile part of the world, often labeled a periphery, which is, of course, a problematic term in itself. And yet I often feel somewhat uncomfortable with the habits that we have of importing discourses and practices that are largely Anglo-Saxon in origin. Discourses that are no doubt the remit of countries with a colonial or shameful slave-owning past. And yet some of these discourses, which are of course historically and geographically specific, have become a global mantra. Once again, if I'm to be critical, the Anglo-Saxon world is claiming the hegemony of museum discourse, albeit paradoxically in the name of decolonization and democratization. Now, I don't need to go into the details of the fact that very often this is window dressing, or what artist Camille Henrot has called the performance of guilt. Museums, without losing track of important global issues, need to focus on issues that are relative to their own histories and localities, namely in correcting their own problematic histories, addressing their own inequities, and redressing their own version of marginalized narratives that need to be brought to the fore. In Greece, our narratives have largely been written by others, namely foreign, occupying, or outside influencing powers. Without in any way advocating ethnocentrism, we need to work to unearth and highlight our own narratives, those that have been marginalized by the master narratives of politics, history, and power. We need, for example, to look more closely into our own neighborhood, Southeast Europe, the Balkans, Turkey, the Middle East, North Africa, and the broader area of the Mediterranean, which in itself is a region with a very, very rich and varied history, culture, and many stories and narratives to unfold. And sometimes I think, why would one come to visit a museum of contemporary art in Athens? And if I were a visitor, I assume that most people like me wouldn't like to see what one would see in New York, Paris, or London. So we also should place more emphasis on local audiences at a time when climate change might mean that museums have less international visitors. It's important to develop a global outlook on the perspective of a local basis. It's important to realize that we exist on and because of this planet, but that we can only live in a tiny part of it that we call our home. The museum of the 21st century must also think about sustainability, ethical economies, best practices, and of course, fair economic remuneration of cultural workers and artists, the other elephant in the room. Finally, in conclusion, and in reflecting on the word contemporary in the Contemporary Art Museum, I'd like to quote Terry Smith from What is Contemporary Art? Being contemporary these days means much more than a mindless embrace of the present. It is an interrogation into the ontology of the present, what it is to exist in conditions of contemporaneity. And it is exactly this what contemporary art museums should be doing to stay relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katerina. As you went talking, I was seeing the questions, and in fact, you were answering them as if you knew what was being raised as a question. So I have just a few to raise to you. One question says, do you plan to invite diverse communities to co-shape your programs and give ownership to the people? I guess absolutely. During your new...
Absolutely. And actually, one of the first projects that we're doing is doing precisely that, engaging several marginalized community from the immediate neighborhood and the immediate vicinity of the museum, which is actually situated in a rather interesting demographic place in Athens, because we are really at the border between the commercial center, the working class district of Neos Kosmos, and also Koukaki, which has become rapidly gentrifying. So obviously these are things that we are going to be looking into.
Thank you. And that's my neighborhood as well, so I'm very happy you say that. I have another question that was raised earlier about how do you museum galleries see the rapid evolution of the Web3, Metaverse, NFTs, and how they can impact museums' current operation and potential interactions in the future?
I find it quite chilling, actually, and I'm a huge skeptic of NFTs, which seems to be another speculative bubble, actually. That I think actually brings the question of the virtual versus the physical. And what I want to say in this respect is that obviously the digital and the virtual are very important nowadays, and of course have been proven so in this time of the pandemic. However, I haven't met a single artist or museum director that says that they will ever replace the actual physical experience of visiting a museum.
Great. And one last question by Luisa Barbosa Cardoso, a PhD student of Heritage of Portuguese Influence at Coimbra University. She's asking, what do you consider of the extreme banalization of museums concepts, in particular the regional ones and the so-called private collections that become more and more museums? Isn't that a risk to what is seriously considered a collection?
Well, it depends what policy each museum advocates. I mean, definitely the model not to pursue is to blindly accept donations by private individuals without actually screening them and without actually interrogating whether they fit into the collection, whether they have something to add. At the end of the day, you know, museums today have to develop public-private partnerships, but particularly public museums, I think, need to be the ones that are calling the shots. I'm absolutely not against either sponsorship or bequests by private individuals, but it's a delicate process of negotiation that needs to make sense for both parties.
Thank you. And I'll close with one question that relates to how you started the discussion, because you highlighted some important elements, you numbered quite a few actually, about the definition and mission of museums. And we're all wondering, in your role, I can hear my voice as well now, will you reshape the mission of the museum What new elements would you include? So what are your priorities in a sense?
Yes, I will reshape the mission of the museum, but I'm not able to say publicly right now. We will be announcing the program of the museum and the new mission statement, and of course the new orientation of the collection with the coming year.
That's excellent. I was glad to hear that. And thank you very much, Katerina.
Thank you for inviting me, Sophia.
You're welcome.